Welcome. This chapter covers the return from Babylon and the rebuilding of Judah from 537 to 420 before the Common Era, a period of restoration, religious reform, and the reestablishment of community life. The exiles journeyed back to Jerusalem, facing challenges from local populations such as the Samaritans, who often opposed their efforts. The rebuilding of the temple began but was interrupted until the reign of Darius, when prophets Haggai and Zechariah encouraged its completion. Leadership struggles occurred between Zerubbabel and Joshua, reflecting tensions between political and religious authority. Challenges continued with intermarriage between Judeans and foreign populations, prompting Ezra to visit Jerusalem and implement reforms, dissolving these unions. Cultural and religious life was reinforced through texts such as the Book of Ruth, the reading of the law, and observance of festivals, including the Feast of Tabernacles. Opposition persisted from figures like Sanballat, particularly against Nehemiah, who arrived to fortify the capital, resist intrigues, address social injustices, and repopulate the city. Nehemiah's reforms included the proper collection of tithes, restoration of genealogies, and organization of the Great Assembly for religious and civic renewal. The prophet Malachi provided final prophetic guidance. Nehemiah made a second visit to Jerusalem to ensure the continuation of these measures, leaving the community stronger, centralized, and prepared for the challenges of the post-exilic period. After 9 long years of exile, in the same month of Nisan in which their ancestors had departed from Egypt 8 or 9 centuries before, the Judeans finally left the land of Babylonia. It was the spring of the year 537 before the Common Era, and the people set forth to reclaim Jerusalem, their beloved and longed for home. And like trembling slaves released from chains, they marched with glad hearts, filled with hope, determination, and a deep, swelling enthusiasm. Singers accompanied them with stringed instruments and cymbals, raising new songs of praise that began and ended with the words, "Give thanks unto the Lord, for he is good, for his mercy endureth forever." Those Chaldeans who had remained in Babylonia, prosperous merchants and landed proprietors, demonstrated their solidarity by escorting their brethren part of the journey and presenting them with rich gifts to aid in the reconstruction of Jerusalem. Cyrus, king of Persia, sent 1,000 mounted soldiers to protect the returning exiles from predatory tribes along the 600-mile route and to ensure that they could safely take possession of their ancient land. The prophetic words of Isaiah now found fulfillment: "In joy shall ye depart, and in peace shall ye be led home." In peace and under the protection of the Persian escort, the travelers completed their long march from Babylonia to Judæa. Unlike the exodus from Egypt centuries before, this return left little record of incidents along the way, for no major events occurred. The journey was guided steadily by providence. God led them by the right path, and brought them to the place of their longing, as the psalmist had foretold. Upon reaching the land they had so long yearned for, the Judeans experienced a mixture of exhilaration and anxiety. Their hopes and visions were now reality, yet Jerusalem itself lay desolate, and large portions of the land were occupied by strangers. In the north were the Samaritans, also called Cuthians, and in the south, the Idumeans. Gradually, these inhabitants were compelled to yield to the returning descendants of Judah and the tribe of Benjamin, who took up residence in their ancestral homes. The newly established Judean commonwealth began modestly. With a population of only 40,000, the settlers could not occupy the entire former kingdom of Judah and were concentrated around Jerusalem, the capital. This concentration, though born of necessity, proved advantageous, as it allowed the entire population to participate in the affairs of the city and the emerging community. Despite the limited territory and small numbers, fresh arrivals soon revitalized the settler spirit. Judean exiles streamed back from far-off lands to the east, west, south, and north from Egypt, Phoenicia, and even the Greek islands, whether they had gone voluntarily or been sold into slavery. These returning exiles gathered around Jerusalem like children reunited with their mother, bringing with them a mixture of social classes, from the illustrious to the humble. They were welcomed with joy, for they acknowledged the God of Israel and were willing to follow his laws. These new proselytes not only strengthened the fledgling Judean community, but also inspired the original settlers with renewed confidence, as they witnessed with their own eyes the fulfillment of the prophecies that had sustained their hopes during decades of exile. At the approach of the 7th month, a period marked by numerous sacred festivals according to the laws and customs of Israel, the elders of the families in Jerusalem, representing all classes of society, gathered together. Under the leadership of their two principal figures, the governor Zerubbabel a descendant of the house of David, and Joshua, the high priest of Israel. They undertook the first act of reconstruction after the long years of exile. They erected an altar of stone, a sacred foundation upon which the future temple would stand, though for the present the grand building itself was beyond their means. The dedication of the altar was accompanied by solemn and joyous ceremonies, reflecting both reverence and hope. Meanwhile, preparations for the construction of the great edifice, intended to become the spiritual heart of the renewed Judean commonwealth, were underway. The rich gifts and offerings that had been brought back from Babylon enabled the leaders to hire laborers and skilled artisans. Following the example set in the days of King Solomon, cedar trees were procured from the mountains of Lebanon, and stone quarried from the surrounding highlands was shaped for the foundations. Not only were Zerubbabel and Joshua present at these momentous ceremonies, but also the heads of families and a large gathering of people, all participating with profound solemnity. The Aaronites, members of the priestly family descending from Aaron, appeared in their sacred garments and sounded their trumpets, while the Levites of the house of Asaph chanted songs of praise, expressing gratitude to the Lord, whose mercy endures forever. The people erupted into a chorus of joy, though intermingled with a note of sorrow, for the new temple, smaller and less magnificent than the temple of Solomon, was nevertheless the symbol of restoration. Jerusalem, long mourned and desolate, began to rise again from her ruins. Yet the exhilaration was short-lived. The joy of rebuilding soon met resistance and complications. Close to the borders of Judea lived the mixed tribes known as the Samaritans, or Chathians, who had partially adopted Israelitish teachings at Bethel, but who retained many idolatrous practices. Unexpectedly, certain Samaritan leaders came to Jerusalem, requesting permission to participate in the rebuilding of the temple and to be received into the Judean community. The matter was of such importance that a council was convened to deliberate. The decision, however, went against the Samaritans. Zerubbabel conveyed to the Samaritan chiefs that their people would neither be permitted to join the rebuilding nor to enter fully into the community. This decision shaped the future of the new commonwealth, as the Samaritans' rejection fostered a hostile spirit. They sought to obstruct the temple's reconstruction, persuading some Judeans to abandon their zeal and even influencing Persian officials to intervene, halting the work for 15 years. Meanwhile, the Judean community contended with internal strife and hardship. In these adverse circumstances, the heads of families turned first to their own comfort rather than the welfare of the entire nation. The wealthiest built large and splendid houses, often using materials intended for the temple. The fields, already struggling with bad harvests, drought, and hail, yielded little grain. Scarcity afflicted the population, leaving them barely enough to eat or clothe themselves, and those who managed to earn money found it squandered or lost, as if into a purse full of holes. This physical distress deepened moral deterioration, while the people had abandoned idolatry. Selfishness and harshness toward one another grew, dimming the hopes inspired by the temple's reconstruction. A change in Persian leadership brought relief. The death of Cambyses in the year 521 before the Common Era and the accession of Darius, the third Persian king, reigning from 521 to 485 before the Common Era, created a more favorable climate for Judea. Darius, unlike his predecessor, was mild and generous, much like Cyrus, the founder of Persian rule over the region. An apocryphal tradition records that Zerubbabel traveled to Persia, where he found favor in the eyes of Darius because of his wisdom. Darius authorized Zerubbabel to return to Jerusalem with permission and support for the rebuilding of the temple at royal expense. Yet the task was far from easily accomplished. Though wars in neighboring provinces had ceased, the people themselves hesitated. The heads of families, uncertain and timid, declared, "The time has not yet come to rebuild the temple." It required the fervent exhortations of the prophets Haggai and Zechariah to rekindle their zeal. These prophets addressed the people repeatedly over several months, from the Hebrew month of Elul to Kislev in the year 520 before the Common Era, both rebuking and inspiring them, while proclaiming the glorious future of the temple and the nation. At last, the labor resumed, and over a period of 4 years, from 519 to 516 before the Common Era, the building of the sanctuary was completed. The consecration of the temple was celebrated with immense rejoicing, occurring just before the feast of Passover. 70 years had passed since Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had destroyed the temple built by King Solomon. Now, the entire nation assembled at Jerusalem to witness and partake in the consecration of the second temple, which was to serve as the spiritual and cultural center of the renewed community. 3 weeks later, the feast of Passover was observed by all, including those who had sincerely embraced the faith, reaffirming the unity and devotion of the restored nation. Although the young Judean community, newly returned from exile, was deeply imbued with the spirit of the law of God and the teachings of the prophets, and although the people strove anxiously for unity, differences of opinion soon arose, creating tensions that were difficult to smooth over and prone to produce friction. The community had two primary leaders, Zerubbabel, a descendant of the royal house of David, and Joshua, the high priest of Aaronite descent. Zerubbabel represented the secular power, the royal authority, while Joshua embodied the spiritual leadership of the priesthood. It was impossible to prevent these two powers from occasionally encroaching upon each other's authority. Zerubbabel enjoyed the support of the people due to their allegiance to the royal house of David. He was a living reminder of the glorious past of Israel and a pledge of the brilliant future foretold by the prophets. The prophet Haggai had called Zerubbabel the chosen favorite of God, his precious signaturing a symbol of divine selection. Yet this very honor became a source of tension. Opponents of the Judeans seized upon it to claim that the community intended to proclaim Zerubbabel as the successor of David to the throne. Meanwhile, the prophet Zechariah had declared that the high priest Joshua should wear the crown, ascend the throne, and bring to realization the messianic hopes, giving preference to the spiritual leader over the royal descendant. This proclamation intensified divisions and produced tension within the community. Peace could only be restored by the withdrawal of one leader. The joint rule of Zerubbabel and Joshua inevitably led to excitement, irritation, and conflict. Ultimately, Zerubbabel was obliged to step aside, leaving the high priest Joshua in primary leadership. It is probable that Zerubbabel returned to Babylon, causing the house of David to recede into the background of influence. After Zerubbabel's withdrawal, leadership of the community was placed in the hands of the high priest Joshua, and, following his death, passed to his son Jehoiakim. Whether this change was advantageous is uncertain. Neither of these high priests is reported to have committed evil deeds, yet they seem to have achieved little in terms of uplifting or strengthening the community. Supreme authority over the people was not fully vested in the high priest. Rather, a governor or administrator, known as a petcha, appointed by the Persian kings or by the satraps of Syria and Phoenicia, exercised the ultimate power over Judea. The governor did not reside permanently in Jerusalem, but visited the city occasionally to preside from a throne, hearing disputes and rendering judgments. Often, however, these officials exacerbated tensions, issuing unfavorable decrees or sowing discord among the Judeans. Many Judeans clung to the hope, inspired by prophetic promises, that Judah might one day rise to great power, commanding the respect of kings and nations. The suspicion that they were plotting defection from the Persian Empire was never fully dispelled, especially after the death of King Darius in 486 before the Common Era, during the reign of his successor Xerxes, known in the Hebrew texts as Ahasuerus, reigning from 485 to 464 before the Common Era. Enemies of the Judeans, particularly the Samaritans, drew the governor's attention to perceived disloyalty, prompting oppressive decrees against the people. Successive governors further burdened the landowners with excessive demands, and the Judeans' position in their ancestral land, entered with so much hope, deteriorated steadily over the second and third generations. In an effort to stabilize their position and protect themselves from these constant troubles, the most distinguished Judean families took measures that would ultimately lead to further complications. They approached neighboring peoples in friendship, forming connections through marriage. This practice echoed the earliest days of Israel and Canaan, during the time of the Judges, when interaction with neighboring tribes necessitated alliances through intermarriage. Yet, circumstances had changed. Unlike the original Canaanites, Hittites, and other inhabitants of the land, who practiced abominable idolatry and corrupted the Israelites, the new neighbors of the Judean community, including the Samaritans, had abandoned idolatry and sincerely desired participation in the worship of the God of Israel at the temple in Jerusalem. The principal Judean families decided to admit these foreigners into the community, and the high priest, whether Jehoiakim or his son Elisha, was ready to implement this policy. Marriages were contracted with Samaritans and other neighboring peoples, and even some members of the high priest's family joined in such unions. At this time, the leader of the Samaritans was Sanballat, a man of remarkable courage, energy, and cunning. He was a sincere proselyte, devoted to the worship of the God of Israel, yet ambitious and determined. If he was not admitted voluntarily to a role in the religious life of the community, he intended to seize it by force or by cunning. Other neighboring groups, including the Moabites and the Ammonites, also sought friendly relations with the Judeans. Tobiah, the leader of the Ammonites, was connected by marriage to Judean families. He had married a daughter of the noble family of Iraq, and Meshullam, the son of Berechiah, had given his daughter in marriage to Tobiah's son. Yet the law of Moses specifically prohibited mixed marriages with Ammonites and Moabites until the 10th generation after conversion, meaning that these unions were deeply controversial and fraught with potential religious tension. The leaders of the Judean community, including the high priest and other prominent figures, were cautious in their approach to the law. They were not fully prepared to violate its commands, and so they eased their consciences with mild interpretations of the text, allowing themselves some flexibility. Yet not all were so pliable. A small number of the noblest families, who had preserved their lineage from mixed marriages, viewed such unions as violations of the law and as causes of moral and national deterioration. Among these were the singers, the custodians and cultivators of the Hebrew language and its venerable literature. They raised their voices against the compromise of their coreligionists, against the blending with the stranger, but as a minority, their protests were largely ignored. When a leading authority appeared in Jerusalem from the land of exile, the minority's complaints gained new force, resulting in a sharp reaction, which brought about complex and difficult social repercussions. Historical reformations rarely happen so suddenly that those who live through them are immediately aware of the changes in their customs, opinions, or even in the language they speak. Yet such a profound transformation overtook the Judeans during the first half of the 5th century before the Common Era. The change did not originate in the land of Judea itself, but from those who had remained in the lands of exile. Over time, the new spirit and order penetrated back to the mother country, leaving a lasting imprint upon it. In Babylonia, the land of the captivity, a significant number of the descendants of the exiles remained. Some had stayed for material reasons, others for personal choice, yet all had been moved by the zeal and devotion of their fellow Judeans. They maintained their distinct identity and nationality, keeping themselves separate from their neighbors, marrying only within their own nation, and living strictly according to the inherited law. Although they could not offer sacrifices nor fully observe the rituals connected with the temple service, they clung scrupulously to those commandments that did not require a sanctuary, the Sabbath, the holy days, circumcision, and dietary laws. They undoubtedly maintained houses of prayer where they gathered at set times, preserving the spirit of worship and study. The Hebrew language itself, the vessel of their sacred traditions, was carefully cultivated. Although the exiles used Aramaic or Chaldaic to communicate with their neighbors and among themselves, they mastered the Hebrew of their scriptures through rigorous study. Particular attention was given to the portion of the scriptures that had previously received little notice, the Pentateuch, or the 5 books of Moses, containing the code of laws and observances. During the captivity, the writings of the prophets had been central, offering consolation to the exiles, but as the moment arrived to give practical effect to the hopes nurtured by the prophets, the book of the law became the foundation for communal and personal life. The Torah, long neglected in its homeland, now received reverent study and application. Observances such as the Sabbath were enforced with greater rigor than ever before, far surpassing practices in Jerusalem itself. This renewed ardor and devotion found embodiment in Ezra, a man whose dedication would bring about a profound transformation in the religious and social life of the Judean people. Ezra was of priestly lineage, uniquely suited by birth to lead in the restoration of the law. He was a descendant of Hilkiah, the high priest who had discovered the book of Deuteronomy in the temple and presented it to King Josiah, prompting significant reforms. Ezra was also the great-grandson of Sariah, the high priest executed by the command of Nebuchadnezzar, whose sons had carried the book of the law to Babylon. Ezra devoted himself to the study of the sacred text more diligently than any of his ancestors or relatives had done. He resolved that the law should not remain a lifeless document, but should guide the daily life of the people. He began with himself, meticulously observing its regulations on dress, diet, and festivals. He then assumed the role of teacher to his brethren, explaining the law, making it accessible to understanding, and urging strict adherence to its precepts. To Ezra, the law was a revelation from God, delivered to Israel through Moses, the first prophet and lawgiver whom he esteemed above all others. With this conviction and zeal, he inspired the Judeans of Babylonia and Persia to embrace the authority of the law, ensuring that it would govern their lives and bind the community together with a renewed sense of religious and moral purpose. Ezra soon established himself in a position of high esteem among the Judeans. His words carried authority, and he was listened to with greater eagerness than even the prophets of former generations had commanded. Ezra may have been aware that the law of Moses was only superficially observed in Judea, and he may have resolved that by visiting the land, he could awaken in his fellow believers a renewed understanding of its sacred value. Alternatively, he may have been motivated by a powerful sense of duty to settle in Jerusalem, to carry out the religious obligations connected with the temple and the prescribed sacrifices. Once his determination was made, Ezra invited those among his faith who were willing to accompany him. A considerable number responded, including more than 1,600 men, along with women and children from distinguished families who had remained in Babylonia during the exile. Among these travelers was a great-grandson of Zerubbabel, himself a descendant of the royal house of David. Those who could not undertake the journey contributed generously, sending rich gifts of gold, silver, and precious vessels for the temple in Jerusalem. Even King Artaxerxes Longimanus, ruler of the Persian Empire, sent offerings for the sanctuary, as did many Persian nobles. At this time, it is evident, the God of Israel was revered among Persians and other nations, from sunrise to sunset. Artaxerxes granted Ezra permission to travel with his companions and provided letters to the satraps, or governors, of the provinces along the route, as well as to the authorities of Palestine. Though the king would have assigned a military escort to protect the travelers from hostile tribes, Ezra declined the protection, trusting that the God of Israel would guard their journey. The arrival of Ezra and his companions in Jerusalem around 459 to 458 before the Common Era was met with astonishment. They came bearing royal letters, laden with gifts, and brimming with devotion and zeal. Ezra's reputation as a learned teacher and interpreter of the law had already reached Judæa, and he was received with every mark of respect. No sooner had he assumed his ecclesiastical duties than he was confronted by complaints from men of strong convictions who objected to the intermarriage of the Judeans with neighboring peoples. Ezra was deeply troubled. Representatives of both the people and the temple had, in defiance of the law, formed unions with heathens. Ezra regarded this as a grave sin, for in his eyes the Israelitish race was sacred and its sanctity compromised by mixing with foreign tribes, even those who had renounced idolatry. According to Ezra's interpretation of the law, heathens who accepted the God of Israel might be admitted to the community, but they were not to be placed on equal footing with Israelites by birth. They were to live separately, as the Gibeonites, former temple slaves who had embraced Israelite religion more than 1,000 years prior, continued to do. Ezra feared that admitting new proselytes were half proselytes those who had not endured the trials and suffering of the Israelite people would allow foreign influence to dominate, undermining the moral and religious gains the Judeans had achieved. The fear seized him completely. He tore his clothes, plucked the hair from his head and beard, refused all nourishment, and sat in mourning until afternoon, overwhelmed with grief for the nation's endangered future. Then Ezra entered the courtyard of the temple, fell upon his knees, and poured out a confession of deep contrition, lamenting that the people had not learned from their bitter experiences, but had relapsed into their former wrongdoings. His sorrow, uttered with tears and sobs, moved the bystanders, men, women, and children alike to passionate weeping, as if their tears could erase the dark chapters of their history. Among those present, a man named Sheshaniah offered a decisive suggestion. Let us make a covenant to put away all the strange wives, and such as are born of them. Ezra seized upon this immediately. He rose and demanded that the heads of the families swear, before the sanctuary and before their God, to repudiate their foreign wives and children. This moment would determine the fate of the Judean people. Ezra and his supporters erected a strict barrier between the Judeans and the surrounding peoples, a measure of separation intended to preserve their religious and moral identity. Yet this exclusiveness did not strictly derive from the written law. Ezra himself, with all his knowledge, could not find in the Torah a passage forbidding marriages with those who had accepted the God of Israel. Nevertheless, those who had taken the vow were compelled to follow it. With heavy hearts, they separated from their wives, daughters of neighboring tribes, and repudiated their children. The sons and relatives of the high priest set an example for the community. The most zealous elders of the people formed a kind of senate, issuing a proclamation throughout Judea commanding all who had contracted mixed marriages to appear in Jerusalem within 3 days under penalty of excommunication. A special court of inquiry was established to investigate compliance. Ezra himself appointed the members to carry out the investigation meticulously, assuring that all towns of Judea adhered to the vow, just as the inhabitants of Jerusalem had done. Even so, some, swayed by familial attachments, showed initial resistance, revealing the painful human cost of the strict adherence to religious principle. The severity with which the Judeans enforced separation from their neighboring tribes, the Samaritans and others, brought grave consequences. The barrier raised by Ezra, the scribe and priest, and his party against those who had sincerely wished to join the community, caused deep bitterness. Those excluded were now separated from the deity they had chosen, and barred from the sanctuary in Jerusalem to which they had formerly belonged. The decree of separation transformed former friendships into enmity. The grief of wives deserted by their husbands, and the anguish of children disowned by their fathers, fueled the animosity of those affected. At the forefront of the excluded party were two powerful men, Sanballat, a Samaritan, and Tobiah, an Ammonite, related by marriage to several Judean families. Both had accepted Judean teachings, but were now repulsed, and they assumed a hostile stance toward Judea, determined to preserve their right to worship in the temple and share in the faith of Israel. Initially, they may have attempted to restore peaceful relations, urging the Judeans to revoke their harsh decree. Within Jerusalem and the provinces, there was a faction that disapproved of Ezra's severity. Some well-informed individuals questioned whether the exclusion of women who had outwardly embraced the law was justifiable, pointing out historical instances in which Israelites had married foreign women. A literary work from this period reflects these gentler opinions. The poetical author of the Book of Ruth tells the story of a distinguished family from Bethlehem that had migrated to Moab. There, the two sons married Moabitish women, and after the death of one son, the widow Ruth declared to her mother-in-law Naomi, "Entreat me not to leave thee, or to return from following after thee. For whither thou goest I will go, and where thou lodgest I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, and thy God my God. Where thou diest will I die, and there will I be buried. The Lord do so to me, and more also, if aught but death part thee and me." Ruth faithfully kept her word, and upon her marriage with Boaz, the people rejoiced, exclaiming, "The Lord make the woman that is come into thine house like Rachel and like Leah, which two did build the house of Israel." The child born to Ruth became an ancestor of King David, the great king of Israel. The story was written to convey two important lessons. First, that the royal house of Israel descended from a Moabitess, and second, that a foreign woman who fully embraced Israel and its God could demonstrate virtues as noble as those of an Israelitish daughter, chastity, refinement of feeling, and cheerful self-sacrifice. This story implicitly questioned the rigid exclusion imposed by Ezra. Might there not be women among the repudiated who resembled Ruth, and children of foreign mothers but Judean fathers who were unjustly scorned? Even the house of David, descended from a foreign woman, belonged to the nation. Yet none of these arguments prevailed. Ezra and the ruling council in Jerusalem insisted upon the exclusion of all who could not claim Judean descent, those not of the Holy See. The failure of conciliation led to hostility that lasted for many years, from 457 to 444 before the Common Era. Ezra, though a man of great devotion and prayer, lacked the power to enforce his will by action, and some Judean families secretly sided with his opponents. Sanballat and his followers, however, were determined, capable, and full of animosity. They seized every opportunity to harass their enemies and ultimately launched an attack on Jerusalem. What emboldened them to take such daring steps, knowing that Ezra enjoyed the favor of the Persian court and that Judean officials held influence with King Artaxerxes? Perhaps they counted on the instability of the Persian monarchy, or drew courage from the revolt of Megabyzus, satrap of Syria, to whom both Judea and Samaria were subordinate. While Persian forces were engaged in conflict with Syrian rebels, Sanballat and his followers acted independently, aiming at the very heart of their enemy. Their efforts were entirely successful. They raised an army, while the defenders of Jerusalem were mostly inexperienced in warfare. Sanballat and his followers breached the walls of the city, burned the wooden gates, and destroyed many buildings, leaving Jerusalem again as a heap of ruins. The temple, sacred even to their eyes, was spared, but it was abandoned, and most of the inhabitants, no longer protected by the city walls, left Jerusalem to seek shelter wherever they could find it. The Aaronites, descendants of Aaron, and the Levites, deprived of their customary income from offerings, tithes, and gifts, were forced to abandon the temple and seek other means of sustenance. The young commonwealth of Judea, barely a century into its restored existence, was passing through a period of deep distress. Many of the noble families, seeking security and stability, reconciled with their neighbors, reclaimed wives previously repudiated, and formed new marital alliances with outsiders. They pledged themselves by solemn vows to honor these new connections. For a brief moment, it seemed as if the work of Ezra, the scribe and priest who had restored the law and reorganized the community, had been undone. The very survival of the commonwealth appeared to be in jeopardy. How little separated it from complete dissolution! Yet the religious zeal instilled by Ezra was too ardent to be extinguished so easily. Some of the Judeans, overwhelmed by grief at the destruction of Jerusalem and the devastation of the Holy Temple, journeyed to the Persian court to seek aid. They relied upon Nehemiah, the Judean cupbearer to King Artaxerxes I of Persia, who reigned from 465 to 424 before the Common Era. And Hananiah, a kinsman of Nehemiah and an eyewitness to the tragic events, delivered a vivid and harrowing report of the desolation of Jerusalem and the suffering of the Judean people. Nehemiah was struck with dismay. Jerusalem, long imagined as divinely protected by God and encircled with an inviolable wall, had been humbled like any ordinary city, its gates burned and its walls broken. Nehemiah, however, was a man of action and ingenuity, trained at the Persian court to govern with a firm and decisive hand. He resolved immediately to journey to Jerusalem and restore order, but his service at the royal court bound him to Persia, and the king's favor, though advantageous, initially prevented him from leaving. Yet Nehemiah's grief became visible, clouding his usually cheerful expression. One day, while serving wine to King Artaxerxes and Queen Anstrus, the king noticed his troubled countenance and inquired about its cause. Seizing the opportunity, Nehemiah replied, "Why should not my countenance be sad, when the city, the place of my father's sepulchres, lieth waste, and the gates thereof are consumed with fire?" Nehemiah then presented his earnest request to the king. Artaxerxes, recognizing both Nehemiah's devotion and the importance of restoring the city, granted his every wish. He authorized Nehemiah to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, restore order in the unsettled state, and appointed him governor of Judæa. The king issued letters to the Persian officials commanding them to cooperate with Nehemiah, supply timber for construction, and not obstruct his work. An escort of Persian soldiers was assigned to accompany him, though Artaxerxes stipulated that Nehemiah's stay in Jerusalem was to be temporary, requiring his eventual return to the Persian court. Nehemiah's journey to Jerusalem marked the beginning of a new chapter in the history of the Judean Commonwealth, and it completed the work initiated by Ezra. He departed from Susa, the Persian capital, with a large retinue and armed escort. As he passed through the former territories of the 10 tribes of Israel, he presented his royal credentials to local officials. Word of his mission reached Sanballat, the leader of the Samaritans, and Tobiah, the leader of the Ammonites, both of whom perceived that a Judean, favored by Artaxerxes, had been appointed governor of the land, threatening their plans of influence. Upon reaching Jerusalem, Nehemiah secluded himself for 3 days, using the time to survey the city and assess the extent of its devastation. He also studied the population with which he would have to contend, keeping the true purpose of his visit secret, even from the community leaders. Under the cover of night, he rode out to inspect the damaged walls, formulating a plan for their repair. Once his assessment was complete, he summoned the principal men of the community, announcing to their astonishment that King Artaxerxes had given him full authority to rebuild the walls and govern the land, and that he intended to remove the shame and misery that had befallen Jerusalem. The Judeans responded with enthusiasm and commitment, even those who had intermarried with outsiders or maintained friendly relations with the Samaritans and Ammonites. Nehemiah, however, imposed a heavy burden upon himself and the people. He faced the formidable task of reorganizing a fractured community, weakened by fear, selfishness, and the lingering effects of exile. The first priority was to fortify the city. Nehemiah personally supervised the work, implementing an organized division of labor to make the labor less burdensome. The work, necessarily slow and painstaking, was opposed by the repudiated proselytes, led by Sanballat and Tobiah, whose hopes for alliance with the Judeans had been dashed by Nehemiah's declaration, "You shall have no portion, no right, no memorial in Jerusalem." They attempted to hinder the reconstruction by persuading Persian officials that Nehemiah was plotting treason, claiming he sought to make himself king of Judæa. They also tried to demoralize the laborers, mocking the walls and asserting that even a jackal could break through them. As the walls rose to half their intended height, the enemy secretly prepared for attack. Nehemiah, however, had anticipated such threats. He armed his own people and the leading members of the community, placing them on guard at strategic points. Each workman carried a sword at his side while performing his labor, and every carrier bore both his burden and a weapon. Construction proceeded continuously from dawn to sunset, while a portion of the force remained on constant guard day and night. Nehemiah himself was ever present, accompanied by a trumpeter. At the blast of his trumpet, the scattered workers assembled immediately around him, ready to respond to any sudden danger or emergency. Sanballat, the governor of Samaria, did not resume his direct assault on the walls of Jerusalem. Instead, he turned his energies to weaving intrigues and plotting against Nehemiah, the governor appointed by King Artaxerxes of Persia to oversee the restoration of Jerusalem. Sanballat spread rumors that once the city was fortified, Nehemiah would proclaim himself king of the Judeans and rebel against the Persian Empire. These insinuations alarmed the more credulous workers, who began to fear being seen as accomplices by the Persians and considered abandoning the reconstruction. Compounding the threat, the heads of several families who were related to Sanballat's faction maintained secret correspondence with Tobiah, an Ammonite official allied with Sanballat. Yet none of these schemes could halt the determined governor. With relentless energy, Nehemiah completed the fortifications, forcing even his enemies to acknowledge his success, and Sanballat and his followers eventually gave up their futile attempts to obstruct the work. Within the Judean community, however, Nehemiah faced a more insidious struggle. Many of the most distinguished families, outwardly loyal, were secretly communicating with the enemy and simultaneously oppressing the poor. In times of scarcity, when the impoverished Judeans borrowed money to pay taxes to the Persian king or sought grain for survival, they had to pledge their fields, vineyards, olive groves, homes, and, in some cases, even their children as security. When the debts went unpaid, the wealthy creditor seized the land and retained the children as slaves. As the complaints of the oppressed grew louder, Nehemiah convened a large assembly to confront the injustice. Speaking with authority, he rebuked the heartlessness, reminding them of the law and their duty to their brethren. We, the Judeans of Persia, he declared, have, according to the best of our ability, redeemed our brethren, the Judeans that were sold unto the heathen, and we even sell your brethren so that they will be sold again unto us. His words carried weight. The rich and powerful, moved by respect for Nehemiah and the authority of the law, immediately pledged to release the enslaved, restore the houses, fields, and gardens to their owners, and cancel outstanding debts. Nehemiah secured their promises with a binding oath, ensuring compliance. Nehemiah himself set the highest example of self-denial. He refused the revenues due to him as governor, advanced money and grain to the poor, and forgave loans when repayment was impossible. His relatives and servants followed his example, living with generosity and integrity. Through this steadfast leadership, Nehemiah overcame internal strife, restored order, and established the foundations for a cohesive community. Yet even after the walls were rebuilt and the gates restored, Jerusalem remained thinly populated. The Levitical gatekeepers and many of the Levites had migrated to other regions after the city's destruction because they received no tithes. Many houses were destroyed or abandoned, and the temple lacked attendants. To address this, Nehemiah issued a proclamation calling those who had fled during the city's insecurity, as well as settlers from provincial towns, to return and take permanent residence in the capital. Many noble families responded, but their numbers were insufficient to fully repopulate the city. Consequently, 1/10 of the rural population was selected by lot to migrate to Jerusalem. Nehemiah applied rigorous standards, scrutinizing the lineage of each family among the Judeans who had returned from Babylonia. 3 families, totaling 642 persons, could not prove descent from Israel and were denied citizenship, while 3 Aronite priestly families, lacking genealogical records, were temporarily stripped of their priestly authority. With Jerusalem fortified and repopulated, Nehemiah sought to instill in the community the living spirit of the law. For this task, he relied on the assistance of the scribes, and Ezra, the distinguished priest and scholar, re-emerged. On the festival of the first day of the 7th month, Ezra gathered all the people, including those from the surrounding countryside, in the open area before the water gate of Jerusalem. A wooden platform was erected for him, and he began to read from the book of the law. The assembly was solemn and imposing, comprising men, women, and children old enough to comprehend the words. As Ezra unrolled the sacred scroll, the entire congregation rose, and when he pronounced the opening blessing, they raised their hands and responded aloud, Amen, an affirmation of their devotion. Ezra began to read aloud a section of the Torah with a voice full of solemnity, and all who were present listened with intense attention. Some, however, could not fully follow the reading, but the Levites, members of the Israelite priestly class trained to instruct and explain, offered short and clear explanations, so that even the least educated among the people could understand. The impact was immediate and profound. The people were moved to tears, perhaps for the first time hearing the portions of Deuteronomy that outlined the severe punishments awaiting those who disregarded the law. Conscience-stricken, they felt unworthy of the divine love and were overwhelmed with grief. It required some time before Ezra and the priests could restore calm among the excited multitude. Yet at last, the people quieted and proceeded to celebrate the festival with hearts lifted and spirits exalted. It was the first occasion in which the people truly embraced the book of the law, regarding it as an inseparable part of their own existence and themselves as its guardians. The moral transformation that had begun during the Babylonian exile was now complete. What the prophets had started, the scribes brought to fulfillment. Remarkably, this pivotal assembly met not inside the temple itself, but in its immediate vicinity, and the high priest took no active role. Though a priest himself, Ezra inadvertently established a precedent that placed the law above the temple rituals, marking the subordination of the priesthood to the scriptures. The people's reverence for the law grew so profound that they eagerly sought to hear more. The leaders of the community, descendants of ancestors who had once resisted prophetic teaching and seemed incapable of reform, approached Ezra the following day, requesting him to continue reading the Pentateuch. Ezra obliged, reading the sections concerning the festivals to be observed during the 7th month. In obedience to the commandments described in the law, the leading men issued a proclamation summoning all the people to bring branches of olive, myrtle, and palm from the surrounding mountains to construct huts, or booths, as prescribed. The people carried out this order enthusiastically and celebrated the festival of tabernacles with greater joy than they had ever known. During the 8 days of the festival, a portion of the law was read each day, and from that time onward, the reading of the law became a permanent feature of divine worship. Ezra and Nehemiah sought to channel this religious fervor to influence those still living with foreign wives to separate from them voluntarily. A day of penitence was appointed, during which all appeared fasting, mourning, and with ashes upon their heads. The portion of the law forbidding intermarriage with the Ammonites and Moabites was read and explained, and the Levites recited a general acknowledgment of sin in the name of the people. The effect was decisive. The Israelites separated from their foreign wives and severed connections with the Samaritans and others of questionable ancestry. Ezra and Nehemiah then guided the community to make a solemn covenant to uphold the teachings of the law and not to relapse into prior errors. From that day forward, the entire community, including men, women, children, temple servants, and faithful proselytes, swore to follow the law of Moses. They vowed not to give their daughters in marriage to foreigners and not to marry daughters of foreign tribes. The covenant also encompassed observance of the Sabbath and holy days, leaving fields uncultivated every 7th year, and remitting debts during that year. Additionally, every individual who had reached majority was to pay 1/3 of a shekel annually for temple maintenance, bring the first produce of fields and orchards to the sanctuary, provide wood for the altar, and contribute tithes for the sustenance of the priests and Levites. The obligations assumed by the people were inscribed on a scroll, signed by the heads of families, and sealed. Nehemiah's name appeared first, followed by approximately 85 other prominent men, though one account records 120 names. This pivotal gathering of Judeans became known as the Great Assembly, or Knesset HaGedal. In a short time, Nehemiah had accomplished extraordinary feats, restoring the weakened commonwealth, fortifying the capital, instituting the law as the guiding force of national life, and ensuring that the people adhered to its requirements. Nehemiah deliberately organized large popular assemblies to impress upon the attendees the significance of their actions. He convened the people a second time to consecrate the city walls. Women and children were present, as before, and Levites skilled in music and song were invited to participate. 2 divisions of the people, starting from the same point, marched in opposite directions around the walls, each led by a choir of Levites singing hymns of praise accompanied by musicians. Ezra followed one choir, Nehemiah the other, each guiding a massive procession. The joyous notes of cymbals, harps, and trumpets echoed from the mountains, mingling with the voices of the Levites. A day of mourning and atonement was followed by a day of universal celebration. lasting 8 days, 2 years, and 4 months after Nehemiah had begun his work in the city, in the year 442 before the Common Era. In order to establish the community to which he had given new life, Nehemiah, the governor of Judah, sought able, worthy, and conscientious officers to administer the affairs of the land. It was he who divided the country into small districts, known as Pelech, appointing an officer over each to maintain order and manage the daily affairs of the people. To the north of the temple and Jerusalem, Nehemiah erected a strong citadel, a fortress designed to protect the sanctuary in times of danger. This fortress was called Bura, and over it he placed Hananiah, a man of unwavering faith and devotion to God, as commander. Alongside Nehemiah, the scribe Ezra was entrusted with guardianship of the temple, ensuring that the sacred house of worship and the service of God were fully restored. The primary concern of Nehemiah was the uninterrupted performance of the temple worship. The Aaronites, the hereditary priests descended from Aaron, brother of Moses, and the Levites, the assistants in religious rites, were to be supported adequately, though the landowners had solemnly promised to pay the required contributions and tithes. Nehemiah took care that these offerings were delivered and distributed properly. The Levites traveled through the countryside during harvest time, collecting tithes and gifts, which were then brought to Jerusalem. Large granaries were constructed to store these provisions, and officials were appointed to ensure that the Aaronites and Levites received their rightful shares. Nehemiah also turned his attention to the repopulation of the deserted city of Jerusalem. He erected houses at his own expense for the poorest members of the nation and provided for their needs wherever possible. Through these measures, he built a new state founded on a single principle, strict adherence to the law of Moses. Nehemiah served as governor of Judah for 12 years, from 444 to 432 before the Common Era. When his term ended, he returned to the court of King Artaxerxes of Persia, retaining the king's favor and departing with the hope that his reforms and efforts would endure. Yet no sooner had Nehemiah departed than a countercurrent began to undermine his work, tracing back to the influence of the high priest Eliashib. The first step toward disintegration occurred when Eliashib maintained friendly relations with the Samaritans and the offspring of mixed marriages, violating the decisions of the Great Assembly. As a token of this alliance, a member of the priestly household, Manasseh, married Nicaso, the daughter of Sanballat, a Samaritan leader. Others who had quietly opposed Nehemiah's strict policies followed the example set by the priestly family. Tobiah, the second great enemy of Nehemiah, was allowed to return to Jerusalem without hindrance, and a large court in the outer temple was assigned to him. This abrupt reversal of policy produced widespread dismay. The people of Jerusalem, outraged by the actions of the high priest and his allies, openly displayed their contempt. Landowners ceased paying tithes and contributions, depriving the Levites of their means of sustenance. The priests, forced to offer up diseased, lame, blind, or otherwise unsightly animals for the altar, could not maintain proper sacrificial services. Many Judeans, disgusted by the corruption and neglect of the sacred duties, abandoned the temple and pursued their own interests, often violating the principles of justice and faith they had sworn to uphold. Those who remained pious and impoverished lamented the apparent triumph of the wicked, exclaiming, "It is vain to serve God, and what profit is it that we have kept his charge? Every one that doth evil is good in the sight of the Lord, and he delighteth in them." Even families were divided. Fathers disagreed with sons, and disputes arose over whether to follow strict adherence to the law or accept the lax practices of the priestly faction. In response, the more devout members of the community convened to plan a course of action. They turned in hope to Nehemiah, still at the court of Artaxerxes, believing that his return could restore peace, unity, and strength to Jerusalem. At this critical moment, a God-fearing man appeared to guide them. Malachi, the last of the prophets, arose to confront the moral decay and to reinvigorate the courage of the faithful. Malachi announced the coming of the messenger of the covenant, a future figure who would bring hope and renewal. He exhorted the people to continue paying tithes despite the misconduct of some priests, urging the faithful to restore the proper maintenance of the temple. Like the early prophets, he foretold a great and terrible day when the distinction between the righteous and the wicked would be made clear. Before this day, God would send the prophet Elijah to reconcile fathers with sons and restore unity among the people. Malachi concluded his message by reminding the Judeans to heed the law of Moses, with its statutes and judgments delivered on Mount Horeb. With these final exhortations, the voice of prophecy was silenced, leaving the community with a promise of hope and a challenge to uphold the covenant in a world still fraught with division and discord. The written law, carefully compiled and made accessible to many through the tireless zeal of Ezra, the scribe and priest who had restored the sacred texts, had transformed the life of the Judean community. The people now had a body of learned exponents who could interpret the law, and in the system, the continuous need for prophetic utterances had gradually diminished. The scribe had taken the place of the seer, and the public reading of the law, whether in the grand assemblies of the people or in smaller houses of prayer, had become the substitute for direct prophetic revelation. Did Nehemiah, the Judean cupbearer and governor, at the court of Persia, ever imagine the depth of longing that existed for his presence in Jerusalem at that moment? Did he know that Malachi, the prophet of later times, placed his hope in better days upon the possibility of Nehemiah's return? It is impossible to say. Yet, if when the years 430 and 424 before the Common Era, Nehemiah suddenly reappeared in Jerusalem, having again obtained permission from King Artaxerxes I of Persia to return to his spiritual homeland. Upon his arrival, he became, in the words of the prophet, like a refiner's fire, and like the fuller's lye. He set about purging the community of its impure elements, restoring discipline, and reestablishing order in both spiritual and civil affairs. He began by expelling Tobiah, the Ammonite, from the residence that had been granted to him by Eliashib, the high priest, who was his relative. Nehemiah dismissed Eliashib from his office for permitting such influence. He then summoned the heads of the Judean community and reproached them bitterly for neglecting their duties, which had caused the Levites, the temple priests, to abandon their sacred service. The summons of Nehemiah was sufficient to compel the landed proprietors to fulfill their obligations, restore the tithes, and bring the Levites back to their sacred duties in the temple. The collection and fair distribution of the tithes he entrusted to 4 conscientious Judeans, devoted followers of his cause. With this, he restored the solemnity of divine service and dismissed unworthy priests. Nehemiah's most important work, in his own eyes, was the dissolution of mixed marriages that had been contracted in violation of the law. This reform brought him into direct conflict with the high priestly house. Manasseh, either a son or kinsman of Joiada, the high priest, refused to separate from his Samaritan wife, Michal, the daughter of Sanballat, the leader of the Samaritans. Nehemiah, demonstrating remarkable firmness, banished him from the land. Many other Aaronites and Judeans who refused to comply with his commands were similarly sent into exile. Once peace and order had been restored in Jerusalem, Nehemiah turned his attention to the provinces, where Judeans living in proximity to foreign tribes such as the Ashdodites, Ammonites, Moabites, and Samaritans had allowed mixed marriages to erode the Hebrew language. The children of these unions often spoke the language of their mothers rather than Hebrew. This development provoked Nehemiah's anger and further spurred his energy. He remonstrated with the Judean fathers, pronounced curses upon the disobedient, and enforced punishments to ensure compliance. Through this relentless activity, he succeeded in dissolving mixed marriages and preserving the Hebrew tongue. Nehemiah next enforced strict observance of the Sabbath, which had long been neglected. The law forbade all labor on the Sabbath, yet the exact definition of labor had been ignored. Judeans in the provinces pressed wine, loaded animals with grain, grapes, and figs, and transported goods to Jerusalem markets even on the Sabbath. When Nehemiah discovered this, he summoned the country people, explained that their actions violated God's law, and ensured their obedience. A more difficult task was to prevent tiring merchants from bringing fish to the city on the Sabbath, a long-established custom. Nehemiah ordered the city gates closed on the eve of the Sabbath to stop the merchants, and the ordinance was rigorously enforced, ensuring that the Sabbath became a day of complete rest. The strict observance of the law, first emphasized by Ezra, was now reinforced by Nehemiah, who constructed a firm wall of separation between Judeans and Gentiles. Those unwilling to accept the severity of the law and the separation were compelled to leave the community and form a sect of their own. Nehemiah likely lived to witness the creation of this first sect among the Jews. Conscious of the enduring significance of his work, he composed a memoir recounting his achievements during both of his visits to Jerusalem. Within this text, he interwove prayers asking that God remember his service to the people and his efforts in preserving the sanctuary. This memoir became a permanent testament to his efforts, ensuring that his name remained revered by generations of grateful Judeans. To him, and to Ezra before him, posterity attributed all lasting institutions of the Jewish world whose origins might otherwise have been forgotten.